such a difficult issue. And I can begin by saying, when I first became aware of domestic violence, gender violence, as a political issue in the 1970s, with the speak outs and all of the kind of feminist formations that were occurring at that time, the first question that was tackled was the question of silence. You know, how we're talking about a form of violence that has been in most human societies for hundreds of years. And we also learn how to hide it. Because somehow it's represented as the problem of the survivor.
Yes.
And so it was actually, quite exciting during that period that formations were developing. There were also problems because there was a tendency to assume that when you worked on women's issues, you were working on white women's issues. We did not yet know how to break out of that kind of racializing, universalizing framework. But I mention this because the very first anti-rape organization I really knew about and embraced, and sexual assault is a part of gender violence and domestic violence. And it was an organization in DC that Loretta Ross was involved in. And then shortly after that, I heard about this amazing development in connection with that organization, which was a group of black men.
Oh, Neil Urban.
Yes.
Men Can Stop Rape.
Yes, yes. And so I remember thinking at the time, wow, this is the future. This is what we're going to be experiencing over the next period. So I assume that there would be vast numbers of groups, formations, organizations that would involve men who are determined to get rid of violence, gender violence, sexual violence, domestic violence. And that didn't really happen. And I've asked myself over the years, was it just that they were imagining a future that would come many, many decades later? Or what was it about the way in which we presented that issue that disallowed that kind of development? Men who, people who identify with men are largely the perpetrators of this violence that we're talking about. So it would make sense that they would be the ones to be in the forefront. But of course, it's always been considered a women's issue. And so, there's one thing I did want to say. I wrote a book some years ago called Blues Legacies and Black Feminism. And one of the reasons I wrote that book was because in listening to black women blues singers, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and so forth, Ida Cox, Rosa Henderson, and so forth, I noticed that many of them sang about violence. They sang about what was happening to them in their relationships. But we periodized that movement as happening in the 60s, when women who were largely white began to develop what was really important, these speak outs and encouraging women to talk about what had happened to them. I just, wanted to, I wanted us to have a sense of how long it often takes for these ideas to make a difference. And of course we want to see immediate change. And I say this because when you're talking about policy, and you're talking about funding organizations, oftentimes they want to know what will be the immediate consequences of doing this. What is your 1 year outcome? What is your 5-year outcome? But nobody ever talks about, what is your 50-year outcome? And we're gathered here today discussing an issue which first became a part of public discourse over 50 years ago. And as a matter of fact, this is the most widespread pandemic form of violence in the world.
Thank you.
And with all of the actions that have happened, with all of the domestic violence centers and rape crisis centers and so forth, the actual incidence of violence has not changed very much. Let me stop there because
you're doing so much to challenge both how we think about temporal change in this arena, but also the ideologies surrounding the frameworks and the mental models that we are often constrained by. I mean, literally, you could walk in the Capitol and you could talk to a member, just say it's a man, and I'm saying this because I've had this experience, where I've said, we want you to support investing in domestic violence. We want you to support this budget request. They say, I don't do that. That's a women's issue. Talk to the Women's Caucus. And say you get this proposal further along, it is exactly the same thing that you described, where people are saying, well, what are we buying with this investment? What are the outcomes that you're getting? How much violence will you abate? It literally becomes reduced to the things that are actually incredibly difficult to measure. And we then lose sight of this 50-year vision of building up the infrastructure that we need to have such a, the robust kind of prevention kind of ecosystem that is required to actually see those reductions in violence that we want. And so I think that's what I take away from your provocation here, which is, we have to disrupt timing and how people think about time, probably do more to invest in ideology around violence prevention and the long-term vision. And we need to find ways to cultivate unlikely allies and champions in ways that allow them to see themselves in the story.
Absolutely.
But I have so many more questions for you, to be honest, because I feel like you have seen how movements have done some of this in a way. And around violence in particular, I mean, while it hasn't become what I think we want it to be, it has still grown by leaps and bounds. And I think in part because of Black feminists who have really stepped in and tried to drive the field to a direction that aligned with their experience. Can you share more about just what you've seen as someone in the ecosystem on the evolution of the field of violence. We were talking earlier about insight, for example, and just any reflections.
You know, when I think back to my own childhood and the lack of a capacity to understand that, you know, something needed to be done and something could be done. I mean, I'm, you know, very fortunate in my family, the immediate family, we did not have direct experiences. You know, but I can remember many stories, friends and relatives, and I can remember at that time just feeling absolutely incapable of doing anything, because the discourse, the available discourse, was that this was just a natural phenomenon. This was just something that existed, and nothing could really be done about it except to find solutions involving escape, but not changing the frame, not, you know, challenging whether violence was necessarily a part of human relationships. And when I compare that period to today, we have made a progress that would have been unimaginable then. You know, I think about, you know, back in the 90s when I was, when many of us were doing organizing around critical resistance, and we first began to do abolitionist, you know, organizing. I can remember that we felt that it was so important to incorporate our political insights regarding domestic violence, that it was connected to state violence. And sometimes people are really unwilling to enter into these big conversations because it appears that nothing can be done. You know, I can remember that women who were in prison were describing how they felt as prisoners of the state, and the violence they experienced, and about them saying that this doesn't feel very different from the violence I experienced at the hands of my former partner. You know, I can remember I worked with an organization in Australia. As a matter of fact, I'm leaving for Australia in a couple of days to attend the conference in Brisbane. And that organization developed a campaign that was called Stop State Sexual Assault. Wow. And they were talking about the state as perpetrator of violence, of gender violence. They were talking about the violence that is inherent in strip searching, and cavity searching, and so, I mean, that was a very enlightening moment. That if you think about the feeling of the survivor, and the woman who says, this does not feel any different, you know, from the domestic violence I experienced in my relationship. But of course, we have a hard time thinking about the state as perpetrator. We have to individualize our insights, and we always think about an individual person, you know, whether, you know, a person gendered as a man, but also in in relationships, the gender isn't always the most important factor in the violence. Yeah, I think that while we may not be able to affect those changes immediately, it is still important to have that kind of insight, because it helps to dictate what kind of strategies we use, right now in the work that we do.
And I really appreciate that framework, because it actually turns us back to the root causes of violence, and it puts the state in a position where they need to be accountable for how they're creating this dynamic where violence may disproportionately occur in any given community by virtue of, poverty and inequality, state violence, or what have you. And I don't think we do enough of that in our conversations with lawmakers to help people understand the nature in which our communities exist in is actually creating more. We're creating more violence than we can prevent. That is something that I think is lost on many folks.
And oftentimes, those who are charged with the goal of protecting people from violence, being the perpetrators.
100%.
Why is it that there's a disproportionate amount of domestic violence in the homes of people who work as police officers? And these are questions that we're often unwilling to take on, because they totally unsettle our sense of what should be happening in our societies. But if we don't do it, we're bound to witness the reproduction, generation after generation, of these forms of violence.